Richard Nee went from studying computer science at MIT to leading human resources at Scale AI. He played a key role in the startup's growth from early stage to one of the world's top artificial intelligence companies. Early rejections and pivots helped him carve out a unique path, which we explore in depth. We also talk about recruiting tips for non-traditional candidates, a topic Richard is uniquely positioned to discuss as both a former non-traditional hire himself and as a recruiting and HR leader. If this is your first time at the Rhizomes podcast, welcome. And if not, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode. Yeah, I just wanted to start by asking a question that takes us back maybe to like a little bit earlier in your life. But I'm curious if growing up, do you remember yourself having a dream career or a concrete answer to the question of what do you want to be when you grow up?
Short answer is I did not have a dream career growing up. I had a couple, ideas of various things. Like I enjoyed reading John Grisham books, so I thought maybe I'd want to be a lawyer, or I liked journal, like reading the news. So I maybe want to be a journalist or whatever. Um, I didn't have a dream career. I think one thing that sort of shaped this was I did a lot of competitive math growing up. My older brother actually had won a national math competition called Math Counts and participated in these, in the Olympiad math competitions, almost made it to be representing the United States at the International Math Olympiad. He's one of the finalists for that. And I was pretty good at math. I had like one state, for example, and grew up in Indiana, but I wasn't as competitive nationally. Like I that which I got in 14th, which in retrospect, very good placement. But I think I had this mentality of, oh, like I'm good at this, but I'm not good enough at this. So I didn't consider actually like math related fields as a career. And I think I had some level of subconscious awareness that I wouldn't actually really enjoy doing that. And I think I've been driven by doing stuff that I enjoy. Um, so I remember being really lost for a while in high school in terms of like what I would do long term. Uh, but in retrospect, like I didn't need to have it figured out, all figured out back then. But yeah, no, I didn't have a dream career, but I had a couple possibilities of things I was considering.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting. I think that just having that intuition when you were younger, differentiating between what you enjoy doing, what you're good at is pretty impressive because I think in every one of our social circles, even like in high school, but especially in college, there's often pressure to kind of align into a specific set of professions or dream careers. So it's just cool to hear you reflect on that.
Totally.
And if I fast forward a little bit to college, I'm curious if I came up to you on campus at MIT during maybe your sophomore year and told you that in a few years you'd be pursuing a career in recruiting. How do you think you would have reacted at that point?
I think I would have been surprised, but I don't think I would have been completely like, this is ludicrous. Because I remember my sophomore year, I had done software engineering internships. So I'd interned at a media company as a software engineer in Israel, which I think the main driver there was the opportunity to spend a summer in Tel Aviv. It was super cool. And then the second year, my sophomore summer going into junior year, I did an engineering internship at Venmo. And I think at that point I realized I wasn't going to be a software engineer. Um, but so I think I was keeping an open mind at that point. I think being a recruiter wasn't going to be on the radar. I didn't think I really even knew what that was. I didn't know anybody who had gone into that. Obviously, there are a lot many recruiters, but not in the world of MIT alums or people that I knew, friends, whatever. So yeah, I would have been surprised, but not like totally shocked, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, speaking of your internships as a software engineer, do you remember particular experiences during those internships that kind of raised flags to you of maybe this isn't where I'm heading next, or that kind of put a question mark around whether you're just going to continue down that route?
Totally. So I remember my sophomore year, I was interning at Venmo, and I was in retrospect, I'm so grateful because it was such a really good environment. They were so good to the interns there. But that summer, I was interning in Venmo, but I was also had there was a student group at MIT that I had I was entering being the leader of, the managing director of, and that summer we were going. I really wanted to dream big, so expanded the organization from before it was called Tech Fair, and it organized a career fair in the spring. And there were a few like nascent projects that the previous leaders had started or kicking off. But I really wanted. I figured actually, I think at the time that the career fair market was dwindling, and the as computer science students were getting jobs earlier, so they couldn't wait till the spring, which is when this career fair was. And we needed stuff that was in the fall and stuff that was like more modern, for lack of a better word.
Mhm.
And we were organizing our first big hack MIT. So the previous year, I think we had like a 200-person hack MIT, mostly like local slash MIT students in January. And then we wanted to do a big hackathon similar. I think at the time there were hackathons run by Penn, University of Michigan. There was one called Penn Apps. There were like 1,000-person hackathons. It brought folks from all over, and we wanted to be on that level. And so I remember I was working. I had my software engineering job, but I was also trying to like run the student organization. And the hackathon was going to be in the fall, so we like helping the leaders of Hack MIT just make this big event happen. We had promised 1,000 students, like probably 500 students, they could fly to MIT. The other 500 were local slash at MIT, but we had not got. We literally didn't have permission from the administration to use a venue until the week before. So it was just a lot of high stress. And I remember loving that job and like wanting to put all my energy and effort into running this hackathon successfully and making this student organization like the best student organization on campus, and attracting the best people and just having being viewed as like the highest caliber group, and just trying to like do the minimum at work as an engineer. So I think that experience helped solidify for me that I'd be better suited to do something. And later in my career, or later as I was thinking about a job, I was thinking operational role at a startup, not like recruiting specifically, but it cemented that I'd be better suited in that type of position.
I think that really concretizes the importance of learning what you enjoy through trying things. In the absence of trying software
Totally.
engineering, I'm not sure you would have necessarily ruled it out or realized that it's not exactly the right fit. I just wanted to kind of jump to the LinkedIn post that you wrote that actually drew me to reaching out to you in the first place. Paraphrasing a little bit, but you wrote that one of the best career related things that's happened to you was not getting an offer from companies you applied to in the fall of your senior year in college. I'd love to hear you talk about that experience a little bit.
So at the time, I was targeting consulting opportunities at like quote unquote the big three. So I guess within consulting, I didn't even know about consulting until entering my senior year. But like the firms with the best reputations, at least for hiring undergrads, were McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. And so I applied to those three. And then I also applied to be a PM at Dropbox. I think it also applied to be a PM to the APM program at Google. I didn't get any of those opportunities. I think the reason why I applied to those opportunities was because they were quote unquote like default. Like of the people who did computer science or math or whatever, of the MIT students who ended up not being engineers but still wanted like quote unquote socially acceptable jobs. As by socially acceptable, I feel like it's really bad to say because these are like really like many people don't get these opportunities, but I guess you normalize your own environment. And I don't think I realized at the time how abnormal it was to even have these opportunities to begin with. And I felt like there were only so many jobs that were like okay to get, and so I sort of just like floated into those because I knew alums, I knew some of my friends who were going and applying into those positions, and it wasn't until after I didn't get those roles, I was able to calm down, really reflect and think, and I spent more time thinking about like what I did enjoy, and I went back to that experience I just talked about being at Venmo the prior summer or 2 summers ago, to then focus in on a small startup in an operational role.
At that time, how did that intuition about what is socially acceptable around you, how did you develop that thought process of, A, B, and C opportunities are socially acceptable and other ones like don't really align with what people around me are doing?
Yeah, I don't think I consciously thought about it that way. Like I think at that time I didn't. I feel like I don't even didn't even realize that other paths existed. I remember I had friends at other colleges like BU, and they were just like perplexed by like I didn't get any jobs I didn't get the roles I was applying to in like October of my senior year. So like many months before graduation, and they were like thought it was ridiculous, but to me, all most of the people I knew at MIT were getting their interviews, getting their offers in the fall of senior year. That's how far in advance, I guess, happens for these types of roles. And so my sense of what was socially acceptable really just came from like these are the people that I view myself as like on a similar level as, just based off of maybe like performance in classes, performance on projects, people that I'm friends with. I'm not just viewing them as competitors, like I'm friends with.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think it's very subconscious, like, oh, this is all that exists versus everything else that can be a great path as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also sounds familiar from experiences I have here in college at Brown and everything. So totally get that. I'm sure there's a lot you've learned from that experience of, your senior fall, but how would you characterize lessons or a lesson that you take away from those rejections and also how they informed your path?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons is resilience and being solutions minded, because I think I know other people who also didn't get some of those opportunities, but I think they just didn't they closed off from there and just tried to ignore it. And I think for me, I realized I don't know if this is a lesson for everybody versus maybe like this is telling me something about myself, where I realized that like if I have a problem, like a deep seated problem, I'll obsess about it. Like it's definitely not efficient and it might not be healthy. But I think I remember just spending all my time thinking about it, all my time talking about it, just probably being annoying to my friends, quite frankly. But one lesson for me for everybody is that if you don't get the opportunities that you were hoping to get, take your time to process it however is best for you, to vent, to cry about it, whatever. um, but get yourself in a healthy mindset where you can focus on solutions. And I think in order to do that, you need to be willing to let yourself feel comfortable with confronting the reality that you have, and to feel psychologically safe in that being okay. Like, I think it could be easy. Some people react different ways. Some people might react to that type of rejection in terms of like making excuses, getting angry, lying to themselves, ignoring it altogether. Those are all very valid human reactions. But and we all have these like sort of expectations for ourselves that when we don't meet our own expectations, or maybe even like the expectations of our parents or family, whatever, whoever like adds pressure into your life, I think it can be easy to um, let that really stress you out. And it could lead to poor decision making, because maybe you're just solving for making your parents happy, or maybe you're just solving for um, feeling happy day to day, so you ignore the problem as much as possible. But get yourself to the point where you can accept reality for what it was, still feel good about yourself, and just focus on solutions moving forward, versus just like freaking out about it, I guess.
Yeah, that's super insightful. Appreciate that. And I read a little bit about the next steps in your journey, including joining Cruise as a recruiter during your spring of senior year. Can you elaborate a little bit on how that opportunity to join Cruise first introduced itself?
Yeah, so I had I was in a class that was like technology policy class. So I think it was technically in the computer science department, but it was focused on how advancements in technology impact policy. And we were like reading like previous uh, court cases that were related to like patent law, or related to how I think what was like on how internet forums are regulated, and how much responsibility um, the companies who create forums like have for like monitoring content and stuff like that. But the overall theme was, how does technology impact society and policy? And one of my classmates wanted to do something on self-driving cars. I got roped into a group project to write a paper on autonomous vehicles. I had actually did not have prior interest in autonomous vehicles. That person ended up dropping the class after we'd already like started the first draft of the paper, so I was pretty upset. But I ended up, anyways. I had to do more of the work in writing this paper. It's like 50-page paper on self-driving vehicles. So I had a little bit of connection there. Cruise is a self-driving car company. And then I met the founder of Cruise when I was competing in a programming competition called Battle Code. I think actually that year I hadn't competed, but I competed the previous year. So I was an alum and I was still like attending the event. And so I met Kyle, the co-founder of Cruise, or I think the main founder of Cruise. And at the time, there were like 10 people. And I was excited by the idea of joining a small startup in an operational role that was like a startup that's predominantly engineering or technical oriented, where like I think I was there was the COO slash co founder. I think I was otherwise the first. Oh, they had an office manager at the time as well. But, anyways, like basically like one of the first non technical hires. Um, and then they had the recruiting position open. And so I don't think I was not explicitly looking for recruiting roles, but between that and a couple of other things that came up, recruiting became on the radar, and I decided to to take the role.
Do you remember what your gut reaction was to the specific opportunity to become a recruiter there?
Yeah, I had a few different opportunities come that time. So this was like February. So I think in the fall I was like kind of freaking out, and then I had processed it, and then in the winter I had started, really like I started being more productive in terms of like seeking different types of startups, targeting startups, like just actually trying to solve the problems that I was facing. And then come springtime, I did have a few offers I think one of the cool there was like one was to be a PM at a tech, like a 30% startup in DC. I think one was to lead university recruiting at a firm. And I think a firm was like 70 people at the time. I remember thinking that was gonna be a really cool opportunity. I think I went with Cruise because it was smaller and I was maybe the first and only recruiter, and I felt like I had a little bit more of an opportunity to have an impact at Cruise. And I think Affirm is a really cool company. And I really like the people that I had met there. But I felt like Cruise had the potential to become way bigger and more legendary. Even though, like at the time, the business model of Cruise was they were selling the highway autopilot specifically for the Audi S4. And I remember just being like, this like it cannot scale. Like this can't be a big company. But the founder seemed really smart, and I was like, even though he didn't say he was doing other stuff, maybe I didn't ask the right questions, whatever. I was like, I I just can't imagine you actually think that you're gonna make a big company out of doing specifically figuring out how to retrofit for all these different makes and models of vehicles. Maybe he I don't know. I just remember like just believing in the founder being smart enough to figure it out, even though the answers he was saying at the time didn't check out. Um, I decided to go with Cruise because of the big potential, big technology, high caliber of initial hires, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool that you had that intuition because I mean, looking back at Cruise's growth, it's obviously a great choice. So that's really cool. I know that in some of your posts, or even I might remember a podcast you're on, you talk a little bit about conversations with family members and friends when it relates to making decisions about career and maybe those conversations surfacing some doubt or uncertainty about, what decision to make. When you decided to go for Cruise, is there a specific conversation with a friend or a family member that you remember that kind of stuck with you?
Yeah, I think on the positive side, so I mean, I think when I wrote that post or talked about it in that podcast, I think I was talking about more negative conversations. But on the positive side, one thing that stands out is so my older brother was an early engineer at Dropbox, and he was like truly an engineer who loved coding, and he built a lot of Dropbox's early tools, products, features, whatever. And that was his main job. But he was like one of the first five engineers there. He also led technical recruiting for Dropbox for a couple of years. And I think talking to him about how recruiting was really valuable at Dropbox and how it was really important, and there's real skill to it. And because obviously now it's like, of course, there's skill to recruiting, but you're college student, you don't really know what being a recruiter is like. That actually made me more confident in becoming a recruiter and joining Cruise. I think ultimately what my brother was looking for out of me was to make an intentional decision versus float. I think he was more disappointed with me when it was like potentially floating into McKinsey or even potentially floating into Dropbox to be a PM, because at that point Dropbox was like a 500-person company with like many PMs. On the flip side, I had other conversations with people who were kind of just like, hey, like I think I remember talking about how I wanted to do a job that I would really enjoy, because I felt like if I enjoyed the job, I'd be willing to like be all in and think about work at night, and like do my best work. And by doing my best work, I actually don't think I thought about that as explicitly at the time, but because in the instances where I do my best work, I'll do a better job, and then I'll actually have better career opportunities and getting promotions and whatnot through that. I was framing it as like, oh, I want to really enjoy what I do. I don't think I had then like bridged it to, and this is why it's better for my career, blah, blah, blah. And so when I talk about enjoying what I do, I think people who are maybe older, and I'm not even talking like 20 years, 30 years older, but people who are a few years older who are like, well, like people who came out of the financial crisis of 2008, who just had to take a job, who became investment bankers and kind of hated their jobs and hated their lives, and there was an aspect of like, you're spoiled for wanting to enjoy your job. Like I stuck it out in investment banking and I hated it for a few years, but then like the big opportunity came, and now I'm a blah blah blah, and it was worth it. And you need to be willing to stick it out and push through the pain. I think that's valid. Sometimes that is your best option. Um, so I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm very glad that I decided to pick what I really enjoy. Um, and there are sometimes people pick what they really enjoy, and there's a lot fewer career prospects to it, which is totally okay. I think I don't think I said this at the time. Maybe I was trying to intimate that I want to do what I really enjoyed and make a lot of money. I don't think I said it that way, but like I think it can be fair to challenge people who say they want to just do what they enjoy if they are lying to themselves and they also want to make a lot of money and what they enjoy isn't lucrative and they're not willing to put in the effort to figure out how to connect. I think there's some Japanese saying for like your career is a combination of like much you make, how much you enjoy, like, or sorry, it's like what you enjoy doing. I'm butchering this. You can Google it later, but like it's practical to think of earning potential within what you enjoy as well.
Mhm.
And the key is just to be honest with yourself about what you care about. It can feel noble to be like, I just want to do what I enjoy and to say that to people. But if you also want to make a lot of money, be honest with yourself and figure out how to connect what you enjoy to making lots of money, if that's the case.
Yeah, I definitely want to look up the Japanese saying, but regardless, that's really interesting to hear.
Yeah.
I looked this up after a conversation, and I believe Richard was referring to ikigai. As far as that mentality of making sure that you incorporate what you enjoy and don't get blinded by what people around you are saying or specifically earning potential, have you found yourself needing to remind yourself these ideas during the
Yeah.
remainder of your career, or like still even to this day, or has it just become intuition and second nature for you?
I have to remind myself sometimes, like I haven't been working officially in a capacity where it's like put your job on LinkedIn and this is what I do now. I haven't been working since last May. Sometimes I'll feel like, oh, like it's been almost a year. Or like, are people judging me because blah blah blah? I have to remind myself, like, no, like I am prioritizing what I choose to prioritize, and I'm fortunate to be able to take this break. And I'm basically right now I'm just doing a few part time things to optimize. Once again, optimizing for what I enjoy, which right now is optimizing for working with people who are earlier in their careers or earlier stage companies and just enjoying the people I'm surrounding myself with. That's my optimization function. And there are moments of doubt. Um, but then I have to actively remind myself, like, hey, no, like these are the principles behind what you're doing. There's some point I don't want to be, not working for forever for many, many years, but it hasn't reached that point. Um, and so I do have to remind myself. And yeah, everyone's human. Everyone has doubt creep in every once in a while.
A little bit more on the tactics of your actual day to day when once you did join Cruise. Your degree was computer science. You had a double major in philosophy, and you also minored in political science. And your internships were in software engineering. So no background in recruiting once you actually started the job. Were you
Mhm.
experiencing any self doubt or insecurity once you actually started, you know, operating as a recruiter? Or alternatively, to not frame this just negatively, like what were the sentiments and how did you kind of put yourself in a position to succeed even though you were non-traditional in that role?
Yeah, I don't remember this as well. I feel like I didn't have as much self doubt then.
Mhm.
So I guess if the question's more about overcoming self doubt, I can talk about that more in the scale context. Or if you want to just talk more about what it was like entering the workforce in something that you don't have experience in, I can stick with the cruise context.
I see. Yeah,
Or
I
which
do.
which
I
route would
definitely.
you prefer?
So yeah, I mean, I guess overcoming self-doubt as a theme might be more meaningful than just focusing on cruise. So if you have that example from a different experience, then that'll be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I think that's more at scale. So I think when I joined Cruise, maybe I just didn't know enough to have self doubt, and I hadn't worked in recruiting before, so I didn't know how like other recruiters were doing it and like how much I didn't know. So I'm sure there was some aspect of like being a new grad and just like generally wanting to do a good job and not being totally sure what a good job was and not getting a lot of feedback because um, it's just an early stage startup and my boss didn't, if it was CEO, didn't have time to give me a lot of feedback, and I loved it. I thought he was a great boss. But anyways, specifically on self doubt, when I went to scale, so this was 3 years after my career started. So I left Cruise after 3 years. I've been the head of recruiting. It was like a 40-person recruiting team. The company had grown from 10 to 700. I viewed that in my head as like a success. And when I joined Scale, though, I really wanted to do HR. I really, for a couple of reasons. One, Cruise had grown a lot, and my goals at Cruise were hiring people, but I did not feel like at some point I felt like the hiring was counterproductive, and I wanted to. I felt like HR would be a good path that's like close enough to recruiting, but to also be able to influence how the company grows and how we set growth goals and like how to make the hires that we do make successful to have a better impact on the company's and success. Um, Versus like just trying to hit my goals. I felt like I was hitting my hiring goals, but then feeling bad about it. At Cruise, I didn't feel like I had the opportunity to like push back on like should these be the goals without it being seen as like you just don't want to like do your job or you don't want to hit high ambitious hiring targets or whatever. So I wanted to do HR. And I think at that point, I knew enough to know how much I didn't know. So it was easier to have self doubt. And I think also HR is viewed as more, when you think of a recruiter, like, when you think of an HR person, you're probably picturing an older person, more experienced. You're probably picturing a woman versus a man. I don't know. I guess for me, picturing recruiters I didn't quite have that level of HR. It just seems like there's more experience related to it, and I think with recruiting, if you really mess up, I think the consequences are less damaging than if you really mess up in HR as well. So I had a lot of self doubt. I remember when I joined Scale, they had been holding off on doing a termination until I joined. It was going to be a very particularly sensitive termination. There were some extenuating circumstances, so not cut and dry. And they're like, "Oh, you're here now, so you can handle this. Great." And I think it totally makes sense to wait for your HR person to join to handle the sensitive HR issue. But I did not have prior experience in HR with sensitive termination. So it's just like, I have to do this well. Like, I cannot mess this up. Um, a lot of times people don't really know what goes in HR. I actually feel like 5 to 10%. If I, over the course of my 5 years as the head of HR at Scale, I'd say like 5 to 10% of my time was spent on things like termination, things that are like where you're dealing with exits or things that have the potential to result in lawsuits, where it's just important to know how the system works, to know where it's hard to first principles. Like, obviously there are some first principles behind terminations. I was like, for me, it's like if you treat the person kindly on their way out, there's less likely to sue. And like you can first principles your way into some things. Like if you break the law, and they could like things like that. But I couldn't first my way principles my way into exactly what the laws were and exactly what the norms were in terms of how much severance to give, or whether we need to have a PIP or whatever. But anyways, long story short, is those the types of situations where I actually ultimately only spent like 5 to 10% of my time in those types of things at Scale. But that was one of my first hurdles, first projects, first task, whatever you want to call it. And it was very anxiety inducing. But the way I overcame, I mean, self doubt is not black and white. There's always some level of self doubt throughout my entire experience there. Don't get me wrong. But I always just tried to stay calm and get myself in a good headspace and not make any big decisions if I can notice myself in a non calm state as much as possible. There were definitely times I didn't succeed at that. And try to, as much as possible, embrace what I don't know. Don't try to fake it. Like, there's varying levels of honesty. Like, when this came up, my reaction wasn't like, "Hey guys, just so you know, I've never done termination before." Like, that's unnecessary transparency, honesty. But there was like, "Hey, this is a tricky situation. It's let me take a couple days to talk to people who face similar situations, make sure I have all the facts right. I'll handle this. Don't worry about it, but give me a couple days here." And it's not like pretending like I never actively told a lie, but I also didn't swing other direction and just like I was not like overly just like, "Hey, I've never done this before," and like overly transparent in like a useless way, in my opinion. So then by being calm and being embracing that there are some things that you don't know, while having enough belief in yourself to know that there are things you will be able to do a good job of, you can tackle the situations you don't know and seek help, seek advice. And when the inevitable criticism does come, I actually don't think I actually ever got any criticism for how terminations were handled, but there was definitely criticism from employees about various other things. Usually it was criticism that many HR leaders get, regardless of their experience level. But the criticism I was given was more framed in the sense of, and the company is making this mistake because it's an inexperienced HR person. Like, we don't have good benefits. It's because you're not like, and if we had a more senior HR leader, then we'd have better benefits or whatever, even if like the real root cause was like financial.
Mhm.
But overall, the point is just to stay calm and be honest with yourself and be comfortable with yourself about what you don't know, and seek help when you encounter something you're not very familiar with.
Yeah, it's super insightful. And what I find interesting about your situation, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things, but on previous episodes of this podcast, a lot of the awesome people I spoke with shared their experience as being older than a lot of their classmates if they came to college at an older age, or than their colleagues if they made a career transition. And they shared some of the challenges and takeaways that they acquired from that. And for you, my guess is that you're relatively young for someone who has maybe very young for someone who's been in that position of head of HR at a company like Scale. So I'm curious if there are any challenges that you attribute specifically to being younger and taking on that kind of responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, some of it were like I did not have as much experience, and that was true, and that's correlated with being younger. I will say, when I think about all the biggest mistakes I made at Scale, I attribute many of them to a lack of life experience in terms of not, now I have a much better understanding of people and how to be empathetic correctly and things like that. But I actually attribute very few of the mistakes to not having enough HR specific experience, because usually for those situations, I was very, um, it was easier for me to very quickly decide that I should seek help, and then and usually I'm in these situations where you can ask somebody like, okay, this is this particular determination. Here's my intuition. Blah blah. Like, have you seen something similar? Just figure it out. So the lack of experience definitely led to challenges. Partly real. I just did not have this background. I had to own that. Partly perceived, because there are certain stereotypes around how an HR person is. I remember, like, I've changed my personality somewhat. I remember at one point my CEO told me I was like super boring. And I was like, great, I'm going for that. Like, I don't want my, and I'm already like super young. I don't want to be seen. I want to fit into young stereotypes in terms of being like, um, in terms of being like spontaneous, unpredictable, impulsive, those types of things. I will go with boring. I'd be very happy if I'm viewed as boring and reliable, stable, all these things that are the positive and the negative connotations that go with being boring. Um, but there was absolutely, and sometimes myself, I'd wonder, I think to myself like, oh, they think this individual person doesn't like me very much. They don't like me because I'm young and I'm in this position and they're jealous. I'd think that to myself, and then I'd be like, but is that true? Am I being defensive? Am I, and there's no way to prove it. There's no way to objectively prove to yourself that the reason why somebody likes you is for good reason, quote unquote good reasons, like you are making bad decisions, or for quote unquote bad reasons, like they're stereotyping you based off of not being experienced, or they're jealous of you, or even like you don't meet the gender stereotype of an HR person. Like, I'd frequently be told, I not frequently, there were times where I was told I wasn't being empathetic enough, and I would think to myself, is that because I'm a man? If I was doing the exact same actions that if I were a woman, would I be perceived as being empathetic? It's like the opposite problem of what many women face, as being, sometimes stereotyped as emotional and work in the workplace, or not technical, or not logical, or whatever. But in my case, I wanted to be seen as more emotional and more empathetic. And I just have to be comfortable with, I'm not going to know, and I don't need to decide. I don't need, there's no like objective like, there's nobody who is, there's no objective narrative, there's no objective truth, and nobody's there thinking about like, not if I'm doing a good job, but like, what's the reason behind why this person doesn't respect me, doesn't like me, whatever. I just need to focus on doing as good of a job as possible. I'm going to try to just, as much as possible, um, I want to figure out why someone doesn't like me, because if it's within my control, then I do want to solve that problem. I want to be doing a better job. But I'm not going to obsess over, is it within my control or is it out of control. I'm just going to focus on doing a better job, and not trying to justify to myself whether any of the hate hate is a strong word. It wasn't like hate, but was justified or not.
I know that you had a non-traditional path into recruiting, and I think it's interesting because as a recruiter or as a HR leader, you were often in a position to both make decisions about candidates and also inform the strategy around recruiting and hiring. How would you say that your non-traditional path into recruiting influenced your approach to evaluating candidates?
To evaluate candidates, I feel like I probably had, I don't know if specifically the non-traditional path, but I do think I was able to resonate better with candidates. I was oftentimes hiring engineers, and it'd be more likely that I'd have similar hobbies or similar communication styles or whatever, that just led to a being a form of better connection with the hiring managers. I was more likely to be late at the office, hanging out with folks, playing a board game together, or whatever. And these are the types of little things that A, help you form generally good relationships, but B, sometimes those conversations would turn into work conversation. We talk about work problems and turn into better ways of hiring people. So I would literally work and do more work. And then B, in terms of talking to candidates, I think there were times I was better able to resonate, just relate and quote unquote vibe better with people, because a lot of hiring is vibes. We all try to make it as logical as possible, and but both on the candidate side and the company side, we're all human. There's a vibe component to it, and that's never going away. We can totally minimize it. I think a lot of great things have happened recently to minimize bias and vibes, but there's always going to be an aspect of it. Um, but in terms of evaluating the candidates, I mean, a lot of my job is not to do the evaluation. I really try to focus my evaluation on the motivational fit, but
Mhm.
and I want to get like a baseline sense of someone's technical ability or whether they um, are just quote unquote generally pretty smart, generally honest, or things like that. But I'm not trying to evaluate whether they're an awesome engineer or not. I trust that there are other steps, and I trust that there are people evaluating that type of thing. I think maybe what my non-traditional background, maybe one thing that did help me with was I in the HR role at scale, everyone's an actor. Everyone's an actor in every job. Everyone has a sense of what the if I'm a founder, I'm a CEO, I'm an HR leader, whatever that is, they have a sense of what someone in that position should act like based off of previous managers they've seen or what they see on TV or whatever. But they have a sense of what that person should be, and they subconsciously become more like that person. And I feel like by having a more non-traditional background, I my mental model of who I was supposed to be was a little bit different. I tried as much as possible to think of I found more success at scale when I thought of myself more as like a business leader and not just an HR leader. And even at the times I was trying to think of myself, I'm the HR leader here, I knew I wasn't ever going to be that traditional HR leader. And so there are definitely aspects of traditional HR leaders that I wanted to emulate, like the gravitas, the empathy, the stage presence, all those things. But I wasn't like I wanted to add my own twist to things. I wanted to come across as somebody that was very approachable. I bet a lot of you know HR execs do want to do that too, but like you don't think of traditional HR executives, big company, not approachable. They're here to call you in and reprimand you only. But I wanted to be friendly and approachable, and I wanted to have real good relationships with the people, especially when we were earlier. I wanted to be viewed as really smart. I wanted to be viewed as somebody who was intellectually on the same caliber as other departments. I think sometimes HR can get a rep of just not on the same caliber as other departments. Um, and so I think my non-traditional background helped me put myself in a mindset of I'm not just trying to emulate this other thing that I've seen, and helped me not only just bring my own twist to this own word, but really think of myself in different ways that made me better at my job. Such as like being a true business leader, not just HR leader. Now I'm on these HR podcasts where they're like, oh, the best HR leaders think of themselves as business leaders. So I say, oh, great. Like, I'm glad that's becoming more popularized now. Because I was
Yeah.
trying to think about it that way the whole time.
That's really cool. And I want to zoom in on a specific thing that you kind of started to mention, which is skills fit versus motivational fit. I know that, I mean, I listened to the podcast that you were on, HR Heretics, and you shared that you think that skills fit is overrated, but motivational fit is underrated. And I'm curious if you had specific experiences that helped you realize this.
Yeah, I actually think there are many, but maybe one I'll just pick is hiring execs. I feel like this is true at every stage, but so my specific context, this skills fit versus motivational thing came up in the context of hiring at startups. This is probably generally true, but I think it's extra important for startups and especially important for senior roles in startups because a lot of the time, I think joining a startup is more popular now than it has been in the past. Many reasons. One, there's just more startups. There's more funding going into startups than there were, 5, 10 years ago. Startups pay higher salaries, which make it more accessible to more people. So I think it's easier for people to default into joining a startup versus and startups trying to be more inclusive, which I think is generally a great thing. But the bad thing is it can try to pretend like companies can try to pretend like things that they're not. And sometimes you can startups, there's a correlation between successful startups and difficult work challenges, tougher work cultures. There's more ambiguity, more hours expected, more ownership expected. You're getting less feedback. None of the things have to be the case, but there's a correlation. And I've seen people think to themselves, "Oh yeah, I'm going to join a startup," but they want the benefits of a big company too. They want a manager who has more time for them. Obviously, it's still gonna it's not black and white, but they want a higher salary, and they don't actually want the things that a startup are optimized for. And then it's especially true when we talk about like oftentimes we're hiring people, we want them to have been at high intensity startups in the past. But I've realized there are many people that I've hired in the past that I wouldn't hire again. And not because I regret hiring them for the roles they were in, but a lot of times the value you add is not just a function of you're capable of doing, but it's also just how much willpower you have and how much energy and you have to just do the job, just grind and push and care. And I think that's probably particularly true at startups when there's just people generally need to wear multiple hats more and just work harder, quite frankly. And a lot of times, some of the better people I'd hire, I wouldn't want to hire them because they just reached a different stage of their life where they just wouldn't be willing to work that hard because they wanted to work so hard until they got to a certain level slash promotion, or they're just burnt out, or they've reached a stage in their life like they want to focus on their family now, whatever. And so I feel like the times when people weren't successful after they were hired, it was more likely they just like didn't have the energy to work that hard anymore. And I don't even just mean work hard in terms of putting in the hours, but like every year at a startup, you have the same job, you're basically getting promoted because if the company is sorry, every year at a high growth startup that you have the same job, you're basically getting promoted because there's so many people being hired in, there's so much more responsibility you have, et cetera, et cetera. And it can be exhausting just to put in the effort needed to not only the hours, but also the learning new things. Oh, you're a manager now. This is the first time you're doing that. Putting in the effort to learn how to be good at that. It's more tasking than just like going in, clocking in, and doing the same set of tasks that you've been doing uh, year after year. And so, if someone isn't willing to put in the effort, and effort isn't just a function of whether someone chooses to work hard or not. It's not just a function of someone's underlying work ethic. It's also a function of whether or not what the company can offer matches the goals that they have at their current stage in their life. And so most of the time I've seen people not work out, it's not because they're objectively bad or whatever. It's because just the timing wasn't right for for them to prioritize whatever was needed for them in that job. Uh, Even if they had worked super hard in the past and the motivational fit was there in previous roles, or they had amazing skills, or whatever. I can go into like a specific story or two if you want, but hopefully that illustrates what I mean by motivational fit and the various forms that working hard comes through in.
Just a quick note. I think my internet is a little weak right now, so I didn't get everything.
Mhm.
So if I'm not like responding in a way that's emulative of what you said, then it's not because I wasn't listening. It's just the internet's a little shaky.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons that I find the motivational fit versus skill fit conversation interesting and also relevant to the theme of like this podcast is that oftentimes people who have pivoted in their careers or started college later in life and are trying to get back into the workforce and apply their past experiences in a new setting. For myself, I found it a little bit difficult sometimes to translate the experiences I had in the military into something that a recruiter or hiring manager can intelligibly understand that translates properly into like this job that I'm seeking. I had to do a lot of work into learning how to tell my story and into understanding
Mhm.
how resume screening works, how hiring managers think. Ultimately, I was able to overcome some of those
Mhm.
difficulties. But I think a lot of
Mhm.
candidates who are in the position of being non-traditional might find it a little bit discouraging to go into those applications and see
Yeah.
that their past experience isn't really being seen in a way that aligns with like what
Mhm.
they're able to bring to the table. So, given like what you just
Yeah.
described as like the skill fit versus motivational fit, I'm curious, how do you operationalize that sentiment of we care as much about motivation as we do about skills, or we want to find some sort of balance between those? Especially when a company
Mhm.
is larger, how did you approach actually detecting that in a candidate and being able to find those non-traditional candidates in the first place?
Yes. And so I'm going to answer your question directly, but I do want to be honest and say that that realization, I think, came towards the end of my time at Scale. And it's something that I have been reflecting on during my time off. But I don't think we systematically executed on this at Scale. I don't think I can say, like, oh, we solved this by doing this great job at XYZ, to be candid with you. But
Mm.
I personally, I really focused, like when we were interviewing execs, oftentimes I my role was to focus on the motivational fit, and that's what I dedicated my interview to. But I think in terms of how I think companies should focus more on motivational fit, and I do think that companies do have systems in place to identify motivational fit. Oftentimes there are structures in terms of what are the recruiters covering in their screen? What are the hiring managers covering in their screen? Most of the time, motivational fit maybe is not described as motivational fit, but motivational fit is covered in some capacity. And if you've been on the other side of recruiting, like I don't know if you know like how structured it is, and there's just a lot of variation in terms of how structured companies are in terms of their hiring processes. But more and more companies are trying to be structured for one and actually have here's what each interview is trying to test for, and here are the questions that you ask, and here's what good and bad answers look like. I have mixed opinions on I like the idea of it. I'm 100% in favor of intentionality in the interview process and being thoughtful around what are you actually trying to get signal and how good are these questions at getting signal. I have mixed feelings. I feel like sometimes the companies that are into structure and process are a little too into structure and process, and there are some things that you're not going to be able to get an objective read on by just like having the right interview bank, but we can say that for another day. But companies, I think, generally are doing a better and better job of identifying motivational fit, even if they're not specifically thinking that way, by having more intentional interview processes, by being more thoughtful around what are the traits that they're really looking for. And usually something comes up. Maybe they're not saying, okay, it's motivational fit time, but they're saying like, oh, it's really important that the person we hire is really motivated to do X. Or like, oh, it's really important that the person that we're hiring is excited to work at a startup. Let's make sure that they know what being at a startup entails. Like it's all that's in the bucket of motivational fit. And so I think that's like you can get a good sense of that just by being thoughtful or hiring in general. In terms of like what I would do, if the question is then like if I were to go back, not to scale, or just any company and trying to design interview processes, I mean, I think at the very high meta level, like it'd be good every few months, whatever, for leadership team, CEO, whatever, to revisit the values, revisit like what the company really has to offer employees. Like are we going to be really focused? Some companies choose to just win on comp. Some companies choose to win more on mission. Obviously, you're trying to like be at least you're trying to check the box in all the things that people care about at a baseline, but you're really only able to win on a couple dimensions. Um, and sometimes I think the better companies, this is what I realized later at scale, are also trying to identify where they're happy to lose candidates on. If candidates looking for a company that really has amazing work-life balance, then maybe we're just not going to be the place for them. It's better to be transparent about that upfront than to try to like mislead them or whatever. So you have that conversation, and that translates into very tangibly your company values, which gets posted and published. But also, I believe there's probably some sort of subconscious um, infusion in all of your interactions. If you and your leadership team are talking about the company values and what really makes this place a great place to work at, and what you're going to double down on, then that'll cascade through in terms of how those leaders are then talking to the hiring managers. And ideally, you're not just having this conversation with the executives; you're having it with uh, company wide, but in particular with earlier employees who have been there, who you trust to like really care about the company and not just there to like cash their paycheck or whatever. But just like you're having the conversation at multiple levels. You pick the right cadence for you. You codify. Create documents, relics, whatever that share what your values are, and then you've figured out how to infuse that into the actual evaluation process, your performance management processes, your hiring decisions, whatever. And then when we're going into the nuts and bolts of execution, this is where like a recruiting leader can step in more, or even like if you have your VP of engineering, whatever your role leader, also if they're the ones in charge of deciding like how evaluation processes work, they can infuse like, okay, like here at company X, we really care about A, B, and C. Like we're going to make sure we have interview questions targeted at those things. And here's who's responsible for covering each of these pieces. And then we have the hiring debrief or however, I mean, I'm used to companies where people get together and talk before we make a hiring decision. I personally am a fan of that. If there are other companies where just a document gets put together and the interviews don't talk to each other, I'm not a big fan of that, but I understand there's a time trade-off. And then we're making sure there's a score on not just did they code really well, but also the values fit and whether we believe that this person would really love working here and it really is a good fit for them in terms of what they're looking for in their career.
Just building off of that, we were focused on the perspective of the hiring managers, the HR recruiting. But if I try to shift the focus a little bit to the candidate, how might a candidate that doesn't meet all of the requirements or preferred qualifications in a job description but does have a motivation and also like a solid set of transferable skills, how would they be able to stand out to recruiters or hiring managers?
I think of the hiring process as different stages, and there are correlations between what you need to do to be successful at each stage, but um, they're not. It's not a perfect correlation, and you can sort of think of the different stages as looking for different things. So stage one is getting your foot in the door and having somebody at the company be willing to talk to you. So that I'll go into a bit, and then there's another stage of passing the interview process, and then maybe there's another stage of like getting. Those are essentially the two main stages. There's different things at different stages of the process looking for, but we can pause there. So maybe you can start out by focusing. It sounds like the candidates from non-traditional backgrounds. I'm assuming the biggest problem they're facing is getting their foot in the door and even having being willing someone be willing to have a conversation with them versus they're in the interview process and they're not succeeding. So getting your foot in the door. So on some level, it is going to be a numbers game. And there's no perfect formula for if you do these things right, then that any company will talk to you. It's not going to happen. I always think about recruiting from both the candidate side and on the hiring side as putting yourself in a position to get lucky and getting little edges. By that little edges, I mean find the edge, like find your advantage so that you can take something that had 1% chance of working out and turn it into 2% chance. And part of it is getting yourself the mentality that you're not going to be discouraged and give up or just rethink whether you're messing everything up just because you didn't hear back. To know that you can be doing everything right. And by doing everything right, you gave yourself a 2% chance instead of a 1% chance. It can work out that way sometimes. But more tangibly answering your question, and I'm trying to answer this abstract because there's so many things I can think of that are like very specific to an individual situation. But there's writing up your resume. I think you were saying this earlier of figuring out your own narrative. I think I'm used to working in startups and I'm used to being able to spend a little bit more time on the people I'm hiring than I think the big company processors are. I might not be the best person, honestly, to give advice on how to get noticed by the big company recruiter, quite frankly. But there are a few ideas. One is the numbers game is not just the number of companies you reach out to, but it can also be the number of people at the company who can take notice. So let's say there's a company that you're hoping to get a conversation with. I would start off by looking at who works at that company and whether you have any mutual connections or you know somebody there. And you probably don't have the time to do this for all the companies in your that you're potentially pursuing. But let's say you identify five that are like your dream companies, the ones that you're most excited by. Maybe you reach out to a few companies, start as a trial run, get a little bit of practice in, get more comfortable, see what type of feedback you're getting. And then, a couple weeks later, you're reaching out to the companies you're most excited by. You go on LinkedIn to start and you say, okay, who works at this company? And do I have any mutual connections with them? And then you might reach out and say, like, hey, I found this role at this company. I'd be really excited for this. Would you be willing to chat with me about your experiences there? People generally like being helpful. There are definitely experiences in my life that make me more negative on humanity, but most experiences in life make me more positive on humanity because most people are willing to be helpful. And I think the best way to get someone's time is to frame it as asking for help versus like you trying to do them a favor. Um, and so, yeah, step one is like see if someone in the company is willing to chat with you, see if they'd be willing to submit you as a referral, whatever. Um, Another thing that you can do is, I think, as you were saying, figure out your own narrative. And so I think it's very common to feel like you need to go through the motions. Like the funniest thing is when I see startup founders, I've been working a lot more startup founders recently to hire their first engineers, and they write their like 8 bullets of like what the role is looking for. And all these people who have like very little career experience start talking in corporate speak because that's what they see other people. Everyone's an actor. Like this is just how job scripts are supposed to be done. Like you feel like you have to write a resume and you have to write in a certain way. And yeah, like build out your resume, but just think about like as a person, what would make another person interested in talking to you? Write your few sentences of who you are, what you're about, and why you're in this role, and figure out what that narrative is. Ultimately, um, by just demonstrating, I know like on the candidate side, it can feel really discouraging uh, because it can feel like you're doing so much work and you're getting ignored. On the recruiter side, oftentimes you're seeing hundreds and hundreds of applicants that are just spamming. And you can do things that stand out. Like I can think of many examples of times where people did something, even someone who like put 5 to 10 minutes into doing something to demonstrate that they've actually done some research about my company, about this startup, will stand out, and it'd be a lot more likely, let's say from 10% chance, honestly, from 1% chance of any given person to like 5% chance of any given person, which might still sound discouraging because it's 1 in 5. That's still 5 times more likely if they've done something that demonstrates that they've done 5 to 10 minutes of research. And so, um, people, not everyone will, but some people will take notice that you actually put a little bit more effort in, and that will help yield results. So I guess in summary, like one thing is seek connections. Don't just cold apply online, but figure out who the recruiter is for that role. Reach out to them on LinkedIn. Figure out who the hiring manager is for that role. Reach out to them on LinkedIn. Take conversations with mutual connections. Try to figure out, if you don't have any mutual connections, try to figure out how you can get one step closer, how you can figure out somebody who knows somebody to help get your foot in the door. Um, that's step one. I think step two is then building out your narrative and figure out how to talk, not just in corporate speak on your resume, but actually like as a person, uh, and demonstrate that you've done real, put real thought into why not only is this role a good fit for you, but why you should stand out among all the other candidates because of your unique life experiences, how they prepared you and whatnot. And practice. I feel like I remember when I was in college, sometimes people would spend dozens of hours perfecting their resumes and fixing the little typos and figuring out which verb to use and whatever. But ultimately, it was a way to feel productive and feel like you were spending effort in your job search, but it was ignoring what really could have made a difference, which were things like, and that push you outside your comfort zone, like doing a little bit of actual interview prep or having someone give you tough constructive feedback about your pitch, or take putting yourself out there and trying to connect with somebody who knows somebody, all that stuff. Maybe that's not necessarily the case. I was at MIT when people were more like introverted and less comfortable with things like what I just said. But yeah, I'll pause there. Hopefully that was somewhat structured and helpful.
Yeah, super helpful. And I mean, personally, over the past few years, doing internships as a non-traditional student, but just in general, and like applying to a bunch of jobs, I can attest to the value of reaching out to people at companies and also just cold messaging, having conversations, going a little bit beyond just spamming the resume. So, I mean, from personal experience, that definitely lines up, but also it's just awesome to hear it from the perspective of someone who's had decision-making power. So I appreciate that. And I know that we're fairly close to time. I have like two or three questions that I want to go through, but we'll just see how it works with the time that we have left. Yeah, this is like a little more brainstormy, maybe, so not very structured. But when I'm talking to you about the non-traditional candidate experience, it in my mind is separated into the candidate's perspective of taking ownership, learning how to tell your story, being resilient, and having a positive outlook into finding opportunities. But simultaneously, I'm very curious about the employer perspective and the hiring manager perspective, and that kind of side of things. So from my experience, it's been pretty hard to explain what a non-traditional candidate is, because I think especially someone who took like 6 years away from school and then came back to college and is now going into like my first job out of college in my late 20s. There's people who have even more experience going into their first post college job. I think companies often have a hard time fully understanding the potential perspective and depth of experience that someone might
Yeah.
bring to the table out of college, because on paper they're just like a new grad. Have you put in some thought into how to translate non-traditional experiences in a way that's reflective to someone's
Mm.
abilities, opposed to just labeling them as a new grad or as an intern?
Yeah. I mean, I feel at scale, we didn't, I mean, I don't think there were definitely individual instances where we're talking about a candidate, we're talking through like, okay, do you have these experiences? Like, how does this translate? But there wasn't like a universal framework. We never had this instance where like, oh, we're just seeing so many non-traditional candidates, and we need to figure out this like systematic way of translating their experiences. That's too difficult, candidly. Um, I feel like this is gonna be hard to have a universal answer here. I mean, the thing with that scale is we had a federal business, and oftentimes it was an advantage to have had prior. I know military is not the only non-traditional experience, but maybe a disproportionate number of your listeners are from that background. There are companies that want to hire veterans who, that is a form of underrepresented. That is oftentimes companies who are seeking to hire underrepresented folks are specifically looking at veterans for one, and especially if they are companies that have government, business. They do business with the government. For us, a lot of their roles had to have clearance, and so it was actively a positive to have like been working. And I think culturally, at one point, we concluded that people with prior military experience were going to be a better fit because of like we tended to like a lot of people we'd hired from military backgrounds. So it's like not the problem I think of like, oh, military people, like for us it's like it was a positive, like actively a positive, not just like different for many of the roles that we were hiring. But I'm trying to take the perspective of like other types of underrepresentation and non-traditional backgrounds. And you know what I think the truth is, there are some roles that are very objective in terms of this is what level the person can perform at, like software engineering or some kind of program manager. There are other roles where it's really hard to tell what level someone can operate at, and you're really kind of just judging by what level they've previously commanded. And that's the unfortunate truth. I would love to tell you we figured out we're super systematic, we don't have bias in our process, we have a way of leveling you super fairly. But I think most companies candidly resort to what other offers are you getting and what is enough to get to hire you. And if you're used to a certain level of salary and that's just how it works. And so I think maybe the best advice I can give you is to try to put yourself in a position where you have multiple options and have some leverage.
I still stand behind like my previous comments about how it's important to decouple the individual's, actionable, the steps that someone individually can actually take as a candidate, which is stuff like, being proactive, learning to tell your story and all that. And like simultaneously, I'm just curious about that space of, the companies, the awareness that there is towards this concept of a non-traditional candidate, this idea that someone might be very experienced and have very good skills that can be applicable to the role, but they on paper are just kind of not being noticed in that regard. So I think those two conversations could be
Yeah.
handled or considered simultaneously. And until, even if
Yeah,
the
totally.
employer side isn't necessarily resolved, I still encourage like just being resilient, working hard, trying to learn how to tell your story. But it's just really interesting to hear that perspective from someone who's also been on the
Yeah.
hiring side.
And to hopefully make this help make people feel better. I'm hearing more and more people say like, "Oh, how do we find the diamonds enough, the gems, the unknown gems, the hidden gems?" And oftentimes you need to go non-traditional candidates, and you need to look at non-traditional candidates to be able to hire those hidden gems because it's such a competitive hiring market, or it goes in and out of being like a really competitive market and not. And I think it's hot again, at least for the companies I'm talking to, which are typically like AI startups. And so I do think companies are having this conversation more, but it's not black and white. There's no high mind of companies that are all like acting uniformly to like either discourage or encourage non-traditional candidates. And so try not to be too discouraged by if individual companies don't have the right mentality towards it, because I do think directionally speaking, the tech industry at least is moving in a more positive direction towards wanting to hire non-traditional candidates. But it's not like everyone's colluding together to you know uh, be more positive or negative in either way.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I really appreciate that positive note. Our recording ended prematurely, so that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you, Richard, for the thoughtful and eye opening conversation. And thank you for listening to the Rhizomes podcast. If you have any feedback, good or bad, I'd love to hear it. So feel free to comment, review, or reach out with any of your thoughts. See you soon.